Under consideration this time, voting access. I'm William Fralin. Under Consideration is a civic engagement series from Radio IQ, Blue Ridge PBS, and Virginia Tech. Our goal is not to convince you that any view you may hold is right or wrong, but rather to leave you with a better understanding of why people may approach a divisive issue differently. The idea of the equality of each individual forms the very foundation of our country. This concept is expressed in the Declaration of Independence as all men are created equal. It follows from this that in any form of democracy, each citizen's vote should be counted equally. When the United States Constitution was ratified in the fall of 1789, voting was restricted to white men over the age of 21. Since then, 27 amendments have been made to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery and granted full personhood to all male citizens over the age of 21. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship and provided for its protection. The 15th Amendment explicitly prohibited the denial of the right to vote based on race. The 19th Amendment granted women full voting power. Still, voting rights for many African Americans remained theoretical in some places, as many states, particularly in the South, adopted laws that added barriers to voting such as literacy tests and poll taxes. This prompted a civil rights movement in the late 1950s and 1960s, led by black leaders including Dr. Martin Luther King.
Let us march on battle boxes until brotherhood is more than a meaningless word at the end of a prayer, but the first order of business on every legislative agenda.
Testing and taxes as a requirement for voting were made illegal by the 24th Amendment, ratified in 1964. A year later, the Voting Rights Act gave the federal government the power to ensure states were not continuing to block the right of all American citizens to vote. For decades, many southern states, including Virginia, had to get clearance from the United States Department of Justice before legislative boundaries could be approved, polling places moved, or other voting rules changed. A lot has changed in the decades since, including legal challenges against the Voting Rights Act. In Shelby v. Holder, decided in 2013, the pre-clearance requirement was struck down. Many states have expanded the ability to vote absentee or mail-in. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020 forced temporary changes that made it easier for people to vote. These efforts were sharply criticized by former President Trump and others. Many states have reacted by putting new limits on voting access. On this program, we have two experts with different perspectives on this complex issue. Clara Belle Wheeler is a former member of the Virginia Board of Elections and a senior fellow at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy, an organization that advocates for voting integrity. Welcome, Clara Belle.
Thank you very much.
Sheba Williams was born and raised in Richmond, Virginia. She is a Norfolk State University alum with a bachelor's degree in business management. She has a professional license in cosmetology and barbering and her master's instructor's license. And she lives with a felony conviction after being wrongly convicted in 2004. Her passion for helping others to be more than a conviction led to her starting a nonprofit, Nolef Turns, in 2016. The organization was born to be a support system for those with justice and court involvement, but quickly evolved into a day-to-day fight for removing the policies and stigma around a past conviction. Welcome, Sheba.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with each of you letting us know what your first experience voting was. So, Clara Belle?
It was a long time ago. But I remember it well, and I think it's interesting you start with that question because most people probably remember the first time they were given that opportunity. Yeah. And I'm old enough that we actually marked ballots then also. I had grown up with two parents who voted all the time, and they both worked, and they would vote after they finished their workday, and I would go with them. I mean, from the time I can remember anything, I remember going with them and standing in line, rain, sleet, whatever it was, waiting to vote and where they voted. So it's a wonderful experience.
Did you actually go in the voting booth with them?
Actually, when I was little teeny, I would go in. Right. And then as I got older, I could not.
Right. Sheba, Remember your first experience?
Similar experience. Both of my parents were working in public schools, and we'd have to wait until after school. I go with them to vote until they could no longer vote. And my first experience, turned 18, and it was kind of drilled into everybody in our family that this is your duty. You go and you show up and you vote. So whatever the weather was, we go to our local schools, which is where our polling locations were. And it was kind of similar to taking the standardized test where you have to fill in the bubble with the number 2 pencil.
Right.
Same situation, but you never forget the first time. So,
Clara Belle, do you remember the first time you actually cast a vote?
Cast a vote.
Now yourself?
Yes.
Not with your parents?
No, yes. When I actually marked my own ballot
Right.
and put it in the ballot box.
Do you remember who it was for?
Maybe I shouldn't say.
Fair enough. Do you remember the first time?
I remember the first time, but don't ask me who it was for.
Okay, fair enough. The secrecy of the voting booth will remain inviolate. Okay. The integrity of our electoral system and confidence in results is really important. The loser of the 2020 election continues to tell anyone who listens that the results are fraudulent, but former President Donald Trump lost numerous lawsuits that made that claim. His concerns have led to conversations about voting integrity across America. Our state government was so concerned about voter confidence that a public service announcement was aired throughout Virginia television markets.
The founding story of this great country is also the story of Virginia, because the American ideals we cherish today were born right here. So democracy is more than just our way of life. It's the grand experiment we'll do everything we can to defend. At the Virginia Department of Elections, we believe the integrity of our democracy is bound by the integrity of our elections. Protecting our electoral process is what drives us. Defending against fraud and intrusion while ensuring that every vote is counted and every voice is heard. Because for Virginian, defending democracy through safe and secure elections isn't just patriotic, it's personal.
So Sheba, having looked at that, why do you think that the Board of Elections felt the need to air that commercial?
So I've been an election poll worker for the past 7 years. We do a lot to make sure that these elections are fair and secure. I have been listening to Donald Trump and people who support him challenging the validity of our election process. The process has always been secure. We question people's ability to show up and identify themselves and show eligibility, as if we don't have multiple measures in place to protect this. The idea that 2020 was the first time that there would have been this huge challenge to the process is an idealistic thing that makes me believe that being a sore loser takes just about paramount as fact. For anybody who has come in and cast a ballot, even before I was an election poll worker, you go through multiple steps. Even to cast a provisional ballot goes through steps where you still have to identify yourself after the election is over. And it's heartbreaking that people who work day to day in the Department of Elections even had to stand up and say, let's put something out to let people know that we are doing our jobs. It only became a question when there was a loss. But it is ironic that on the flip side of politics, changing over hands, there is no question about the validity of the results if you're the winner. So, it is an American thing. And just to be clear, I am a citizen of this country. I am a citizen of Virginia. I care just as much about election integrity, but there was no security breach in our elections. Even from the forensic results of the election's validity, there showed no security issues. But being the loudest in the room in this society means being the person that's right. So it's a shame that it had to be put out, but I think it is in direct response to the challenge of the job that those people, the registrars, do every day.
Right. So, Clara Belle, when an election is questioned, what does that do to the body politic? And do you think this ad was a response? I think, as Sheba's saying, that what I hear her saying is that it was unfortunate this was necessary. Do you look at it that way?
That's a multifold question. Good moderator. You know how to interview. Elections are called into question for many reasons. For instance, Stacey Abrams is still questioning and never actually put out a statement that she conceded the election. So there are many people who question the validity of elections all over the country for various reasons. And you have to look at the reason in each question. Is it the rolls are not being maintained properly and people are voting who no longer live in that state? We have a strong federalist system by which each state administers its own elections. Mm-hmm. And so the way an election is conducted in Pennsylvania is different than Arizona or California or Virginia. And you have to look at how that state operates, how the officers of election are educated, how the poll watchers or the observers are permitted or not permitted to see what's going on. I liken that to the analogy of a child, and I won't say a little boy, a child who goes into a candy store and there's no clerk there. And he says, like that candy. And he grabs a piece of candy and he runs out the door. Well, he wouldn't have done that if there'd been a clerk or the shop owner standing there saying, hey, Johnny, you want to buy a piece of candy? In many states, in past elections, we haven't had anyone observing. People behave better when somebody's watching.
Right, and we're going to get into the state-federal divide and exactly who's responsible for ensuring free and fair elections. I think the point of the ad was to sort of reconfirm and let the voting public know that they should have confidence in the outcome of the elections. I suspect, do you believe that has been achieved?
No. I mean, there's still a divide. It's not necessarily about the facts, because in the age of social media, it is really about who puts out the most compelling story. Like if we think about the quote about, if you want to hide something from a person, put it in a book. Most people will go to social media or the most entertaining video before they will actually read a report. So it's still being challenged. We still hear that there's not confidence in our systems.
So, Clara Belle, do you believe that video was a response to what she was talking about, this sort of the social media rumor mill, or?
I agree with what you just said. Yeah. People will believe whatever they want to believe, and seldom do they actually dig in to get the facts. Right. The ad was all about feelings. There weren't any facts in the ad.
Right.
It was put out by a particular political established group, and it didn't talk about facts. There are lots of really good facts about Virginia elections. There's some really questionable facts, and you have to be able to sort the facts from the emotion. when you're looking at elections.
So I think one of the things that I've heard talked about is this question of, is voter fraud rampant, or is it affecting the outcome of elections? Sheba, for you, at the intro we talked about each person's vote should count equally. If one person's vote is canceled by somebody that voted inappropriately, what does that say about their ability to exercise their own constitutional right, even if it doesn't affect the outcome?
I think that it is important to not take away, cancel is not the right word.
Okay.
The idea that someone cancels out someone else's vote is inaccurate. In the facts of the forensic audits that have taken place, there's been less than a 3% question about the validity of a vote in our last election. And that is something that is in the forensic audit results that last came out. Each person's vote should count as long as they are allowed to vote. When we go through the process of counting votes, no matter what the end result is, a person should not be allowed to say that this end result that we are looking at, the numbers of the end result, are not valid just because they disagree with the end result. That goes for me. Mm-hmm. That goes for others. You know, and I am not a person who operates from a partisan stance. I look at the issues and the facts and I vote on what is of value to me. And I'm not tied down to a particular party, even though the elections will kind of make you be there. It really is about having conversations with people who are running for office and understanding what they care about, or even listening to debates or what have you. But to say that we're canceling out a person's vote, you are bound to have bad actors throughout life in any facet of life. People have to understand that their vote matters no matter what is going on around them, because when you go into that voting booth and you make a decision about who represents your children on school boards or city council or in our highest office in the land, in the White House, you're voting your choice and your values and what matters to you. It is succinct. It is too much to worry about what other people are doing to undermine that. And in the reality of it all, as a Black American, my vote has been undermined well before we get to the polling booth. The disenfranchisement of individuals in our country has gone on for as long as we have been in this country, if we're being honest. But the law of a person having the ability to vote about what they care about is between that person and their values.
Right, and we're gonna get into some of those specific individual issues as we go forward. We've got some specific questions to ask about that. So Clara Belle, is it important that the outcome is perfect? Does the vote toll have to be exactly right, or somebody's been disenfranchised?
The outcome should be accurate.
Right.
The number of ballots and the number of votes cast should accurately be reported and recorded as the voters cast their ballots. Right. That's absolutely necessary. Every vote should count. Every vote should be recorded accurately. When I was on the State Board of Elections, we had a tie. It's only happened a couple of times in the history of Virginia.
I remember that.
And in that particular House of Delegates race, they did a recount, which the Virginia Code provides you can have, and they did it. And they did the recount, and it was still a tie. So the State Board of Elections pulled a name out of a bowl. And because the people were equally divided. Half the people wanted one candidate, there had appeared to be no problem with the ballots that were cast.
Right.
The election took place the way it was supposed to take place. And so pulling the name out of a bowl is the way the code says we followed the law.
Right.
We had a provision. What's important is that the people who vote are legitimate, legal voters. Everyone, every voter, and I've said this probably every time I speak about elections, I talk about uniformity, which is just what she was saying. Every voter is treated in a uniform, fair fashion. It's got to be that way. It doesn't matter whether you're an R or a D, or your race or religion, or you're a newly minted citizen who just swore your allegiance to the United States 2 days ago and now you get to vote, or you've been here your whole life. We have to have uniformity. In Virginia, there's never been a forensic audit of an election. So we haven't done that.
What
So
is,
I can't.
What is that? What is
Well,
that?
it depends on who's writing the rules.
Right.
There is no clear definition of what a forensic audit is. We haven't had one. In Virginia, the General Assembly has passed several bills to provide for risk limiting audits, which are statistical probabilities. But they don't tell you whether the ballots actually were counted correctly. They don't tell you who voted. They don't tell you, did someone come into a polling place, which is what the Code of Virginia provides today in the election that we're having right now. If a person comes into a polling place and says, I'm Susie Q and I live at 13 Maple Street, and Susie Q is a registered voter and Susie Q's name is on the poll book, that person does not have to produce any ID.
Right.
And they can sign a statement that says, I attest and affirm that I am Susie Q, and you sign it.
Right. Well,
There's no ID.
Right. So yeah, that's a good segue into our next segment, because we're gonna talk about, you know, and again, the subject of this show is voter access and making sure that people have equal access and what that actually means. In Virginia, the General Assembly passed a bill called the Virginia Voting Rights Act, intended to codify the 1965 Federal Voting Rights Act into Virginia law. The legislation grants Virginia's Attorney General broad powers to investigate allegations of discrimination against voters, gives his office pre-clearance authority, and establishes voter rights. The legislation passed the Virginia House of Delegates on a 55-45 vote, where all Democrats voted for it and all Republicans voted against. The Senate vote was 21-19, also on party lines. In the most recent General Assembly session, multiple bills affecting voting access were debated. One of those bills would have limited the absentee period to 2 weeks, down from the current 45 days. Republican delegate Philip Scott argued that early voting was putting an undue burden on the Registrar of Spotsylvania County.
And the complaint from my local registrar's office and local election officers is that it's just too long. It's too much time to try and get staff to be able to do that, because it's not a regular employment, or to get volunteers to be able to help out. And so their request was to consider shortening it to 2 weeks, which, if you take the majority of the states across our great nation, the average is 2 weeks of early voting. Some have longer, some have less. And so that was where we got that number from. And so we're just trying to make sure that we are giving an opportunity for folks to still have access to voting early. Another complaint that we received was that the hours of 8:30 to 4:30 limited the access to the ballot. And so what this bill does is it actually expands the hours of voting from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. to allow folks to be able to go and vote before they go to work or after they go to work, depending on what their schedule may be.
Clara Belle, I saw you sitting in the audience in our video clip. Our radio audience can't see that, but I know you were there. So what was your thoughts about that bill?
I was there. That was the Senate P&E, Privileges and Election. And the bill made some really salient points. 45 days of in-person absentee voting is the longest period of in-person absentee voting in the country, far and away the longest. It requires the registrars to have their offices open, to be available, to have the machines up and to have assistance. It is an extraordinary expense for which there is no documented accounting. Nobody knows what it costs their county or their city to operate for 45 days. In addition, it's tiring. The registrars have a big job, and they have to be on, and they have to be accurate for 45 days before Election Day.
Right. But aren't they open 9 to 5 anyway?
They're open 9 to 5 anyway, but they're not open for no excuse in-person absentee voting,
Okay.
which means they have to be able to check people in on the poll books to make sure they're registered voters. They have to give them the correct ballot, which this year is an even bigger job. Mm-hmm. They have to make sure the machines are up and operational. And then they have to tabulate the machines, not count the ballots, but check the machines every day for 45 days.
Gotcha.
It's long.
Right. So, Sheba, I suspect you have a different view of that bill.
Not too different, but access is important. And to say that the cost is exorbitant for democracy is a bit of it's problematic in the fact that we don't know what people deal with. Since 2020, when COVID has been a thing, there have been people who have not been able to show up on day one, not been able to show up in a 14-day period, not been able to show up in person at all because of COVID or different things. And I think when the bill was being argued, there were people who said, listen, if I contract COVID, if I contract COVID today and I have to quarantine for 15 days, guess what? I lose the ability to cast my ballot. If the only means that I can cast my ballot is by mail, because I am in the military and I'm in another country, and we know how our mail system has operated, then that means that my ballot doesn't count. The inability to fall within these and think that our registrars who are there working every day cannot manage those things is something that I question. Like I worked at these elections. I have been a volunteer. This year there was a call for volunteers to operate in the 45-day period, and they asked us to commit to being there Monday through Friday. There are people who commit to it, and for the sake of democracy, I commit to it, as I should. Now, everybody can't do that, but everybody is not able to come at the same time. Like we have an election day. We've always had absentee ballots to be cast because we've always had our military who've operated overseas. The veterans in my family have had to use the mail system to vote when they were not in Virginia. So the costs are something that I think should be looked at, but it doesn't mean that we should take away a person's ability to show up when they can show up and give the ability for the most amount of people to participate in the process.
So, Sheba, I hear you saying that the balance of the cost is worth it, and what I hear you saying, Clara Belle, is it may not be. And there's a difference between in-person absentee voting and mail-in voting, right? Which is a different situation.
We have both.
Right.
And anyone who is a registered voter in Virginia can request an absentee ballot beginning the day after the most recent general election. So you've got 12 months to request an absentee ballot. And you can do that from anywhere, whether you're forward deployed military and you can do that electronically if you are a forward deployed military. You can get an absentee ballot mailed to anywhere you happen to be, whether it's your registered voter address or Tahiti, wherever you are. That can take place. Last year for the 2021 election, and if you had a longer clip, you would see the graph that shows that in-person absentee voting for 45 days. And if you look at the graph running from 45 days and the votes were kind of right along the baseline. And 2 weeks before the election, the access of people coming in to vote went way up on the curve. So it showed that the vast majority of people who wanted to vote before Election Day, but not by mail, took place in the last 2 weeks.
Right.
So if you're trying to accommodate the most good for the most people, thank you, Jeremy Bentham, you look at the last 2 weeks.
Right.
Because that's when most people come in, remembering they can also vote by mail.
Right. So I do think that there may be a situation where a lot of people wait to make their decision, particularly if they're undecided, because they want more information. Sheba, what do you think about people that cast an early vote, maybe, and new information comes to light later? How far out should we be going before we need to sort of say, okay, we all have the information we need to make our informed decision?
I think it's not our business what people decide, when people decide to vote, what they decide to vote on, who they decide to support. I don't think it's our business to question why a person wants to vote at the time and place they want to vote. I think that there are multiple reasons, and it's nobody's business why I decide to vote in person or request an absentee ballot or show up at my polling place. It is not anyone else's concern whether I'm a college student or I'm someone who fell ill, or in my situation when my grandmother was in hospice and I had to decide, hey, let me run down here when it's convenient for me to cast my vote before the election, because I typically vote in person. But when we had my grandmother in her home dying, I had to get away when I could get away, but I shouldn't have to explain that to any person, any other person in the country. And if new information comes up and I have already cast my ballot, then that is something that I have to reckon with. It is not anyone else's business, not even the registrar, why. And I should not have to explain, oh, here's my excuse of the 13 or so excuses that you give me, because it should be my decision when and who I vote for, not necessarily where, because I am going to follow the rules. But to say that, okay, well, you voted on day one of early voting, we're not going to count your vote. We're going to take the last 2 weeks, because that's when most people who procrastinate show up.
Well, I think what Clara Belle's saying is not saying that. She's saying that the evidence shows that that's when most people decide. And I think what you're saying is, what I hear you saying is, that's not anybody's business. As long as you follow the law, you should be able to vote whenever you want to. So Clara Belle, I think you had something you wanted to respond to that.
I like the fact that data should help people make the decision on how they vote, however they want to vote, and whatever data they use. Where do they get their facts? Gee, it would be nice if they got facts and not hyperbole or campaign rhetoric or whatever. But we've always heard about the October surprise. Something comes out at the end of a campaign, and people who voted 45 days, I could have had a V8. Well, I didn't know about that.
Right.
I would have changed my vote. So the closer you can get to Election Day, the more information any voter will have. And they won't, because there have been cases since the 45 days of in-person absentee voting was enacted in Virginia. There have been lots of people calling up and saying, can I change my vote? Can I change my vote? Nope. Once your ballot goes in the box, there's no changing.
You can't vote twice.
You can't vote twice.
Okay. Other bills that failed in the General Assembly, one would have prevented third-party organizations from sending voters pre-printed application forms for absentee ballots. And finally, there was a bill from Republican Delegate Lee Ware that would have banned permanent absentee ballots, shortened the early voting period, and required presentation of photo ID prior to voting.
About photo ID, there is wide public polling that shows that the support for this crosses every demographic group, every partisan group. In addition, the 2005 Bipartisan Commission on Federal Election Reform was chaired by President Jimmy Carter, former Secretary of State James Baker, relevant to this is, and I quote, "The electoral system cannot inspire public confidence if no safeguards exist to deter or detect fraud or to confirm the identity of voters. Photo IDs currently are needed to board a plane, enter federal buildings, and cash a check. Voting is equally important," said President Carter, whose involvement in elections is very widely known.
So let's focus on the photo ID requirement. That's been something that's been debated in the General Assembly and in the nation for a long time. So, Sheba, what's your perspective on the requiring a photo ID?
I don't disagree. I would like to see everyone present a photo ID. I think that is a common sense thing. I know where it comes from. I know that there are people who don't have the funds to pay for a DMV ID. I know that in Richmond, and I'm not sure how other counties handled it, there was the ability to obtain a free photo ID. In my opinion, I would argue that there's no excuse for not having photo ID. I don't disagree with that part.
Right. Okay. So what do you think, Clara Belle?
May I get up and hug her?
No.
We're all set. The photo ID, and when the General Assembly passed the photo ID requirement law in Virginia, part of that law was that the registrars and other localities that were or other locations in the Virginia government took free photo IDs. It was really a fun time. Everybody had these little cameras, and you could take photo IDs.
I'm sure there are folks in our audience that would disagree. So let me just sort of push back a little bit. When you create a barrier to exercising a fundamental right, I mean, we didn't have photo IDs for the most of the history of the country. So if you look at a sort of an originalist look at that, right, then there was no such thing as a photo ID, so why would we require it now?
When we first started voting in Virginia, we didn't have secret ballot. Would you go back and change to not having a secret ballot? You don't have to answer that.
No, I'll answer that. No, I'm good with secret ballots. Fair enough.
The reason, as Sheba just pointed out, and as the law says, photo IDs were free. As Mayor Young said, you need one to get around and navigate our system. If you are using Medicare or Medicaid, you have to have a photo ID to prevent insurance fraud. Mm-hmm. Everybody can get a free photo ID, and it identifies you and it protects your ballot, because then someone can't come in to the polling place and say, "I'm Clara Belle Wheeler," and vote, and then I come in and somebody's already voted my ballot.
Right. So what do you think, Sheba, about sometimes people say that the remedy to some of these laws is you can always cast a provisional ballot. So you've worked elections. What's your understanding of that, and does that cure these problems? Just say, fine, if somebody says they were you vote it and we'll figure it out later?
I think that is a cure, but I don't think that is a cure that we should rely on as a means to, we will agree on this subject. I think that there are multiple means of obtaining an ID, and if there are situations where a person does not have an ID, because it happens. People forget their ID, it's 7 o'clock, and they rush there from work. They do this provisional ballot, but I don't want to see that be the end-all, be-all. I don't want the election workers to have to unnecessarily hold these provisional ballots for 2 weeks, and we as the general public are waiting on the results until someone comes in and shows an ID or shows proof that they are who they say they were. I think that we have accommodations for people who do not have a photo ID in situations where they are doing their best to get there, but I think that it causes unnecessary additional work when people just say, yeah, I didn't bring an ID today, I need to vote. And yes, you can prove who you are by answering a series of questions if this is not your first time voting. When you are a first time voter, you have to have that ID. It's not based on the fact that we're saying just show up to the polls without ever showing a photo ID. First-time voters have to show up in person. They have to produce proof of their identity. But I'm not saying just get rid of the provisional ballots, because there are situations where a person doesn't have it. When we have people who are newly minted citizens, they may not have an ID, but we're talking about giving access to the vote by showing an electric bill. But a photo ID is something that I believe a person has to carry by law on their person anyway.
Right. So I suspect in that tied election, Clara Belle, that you had to preside over as a member of the State Board of Elections. Provisional ballots in that race, I'm sure, were scrutinized pretty closely.
Just for the people who are listening, a provisional ballot is a real ballot. It looks like a real ballot. The voter folds it up, puts it in a green, it's the only thing that's green in the entire election process, a green provisional ballot. They must fill in the required information, sign it, because they're attesting that the information is correct. The officer of election or the registrar's assistant signs it, and that envelope goes to the provisional ballot canvas, which in every location is composed of the 3 members of the electoral board. And then they review the one of the 6 reasons why people cast a provisional ballot and decide whether that ballot should be counted or not.
In public?
It's interesting. The provisional canvass is not a public meeting. It's the registrars, the assistant registrars, the 3 members of the electoral board, and 1 authorized representative from each party or any independent candidate whose name is on the ballot. And the reason it's not an open is because you may be discussing Social Security numbers. You may be discussing whether somebody's mental status has been challenged. There are private matters that are discussed.
Or how they voted. We just had earlier. We don't want to know that. Right?
You never know how somebody's.
Even in a provisional ballot.
Even in a provisional ballot, if the ballot is accepted as valid, one of the members of the electoral board slits open the envelope, takes the ballot out, unfolded, it's still folded up, and puts it in the provisional ballot box. And after all the provisional ballots that are counted are put in that box,
gotcha.
And you never know, unless in your locality there's only 1 provisional ballot.
Right,
But
right.
that's hardly
that
ever
would
happens.
be unusual.
Very unusual.
Well, let's turn now to this balance of power between who's deciding, the federal government or state governments, of how we conduct elections. Should Virginia set its voting rules, or should the federal government set them for Virginians? Who has the right to determine the rules for voting in the United States? The 14th Amendment of the Constitution contains what is known as the Equal Protection Clause, which sets as law that citizens in all states must have the same basic rights. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 established that practices in many southern states had effectively denied the right to vote to black citizens. Democrats in Congress have proposed legislation to restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and restore the pre-clearance requirement that applied to only certain southern states. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2021 was named after Congressman John Lewis, a civil rights activist who represented Georgia's 5th Congressional District for 33 years until he passed away in 2020. The Democratic-controlled House of Representatives, on a 219 to 212 vote, passed the legislation, but it failed to get the 60 required votes in the United States Senate to move forward. Let's start with Clara Belle. Who should make these decisions? The federal government or state governments?
I'm a states' rights girl, so I'm going to go with states. There are certain laws that should be equally applied through all 50 states. You have to be 18 years of age to vote, period. So that some state doesn't say, well, we let our people vote at 16. You must be a citizen of the United States to vote. That should apply to all states. The nuance of what are the hours of our polling places, how do you have observers, what do you call your election officials, what do you call your registrars, what what's the distribution of precincts in a community, those little differences. What type of voting machines you use. Do you use paper ballots that go through optical scan machines? Do you do push screen DREs that we used to use in Virginia? Those are the, they don't really talk about rights. That does not, those little nuances can be left to the states. And
But would so I think some might say yes, but those little nuances were what kept African Americans from voting for a long time.
And that's all been corrected. I mean, those, there are no states, there are no laws in the country that discriminate at all based on anything, race, creed, sex, gender, religion. I mean, it doesn't matter.
Right.
You can vote.
So Sheba, so what Clara Belle is saying is on its facially valid, they're neutral. Do you agree that they don't have disparate impact to different groups?
I believe in our state's ability to make the decisions about voting, but I disagree about discrimination or disparate impact.
Right.
The ability, like the fiscal piece, depends on which location you're in. We're talking about, but we're talking about rights. So the trigger of disparate and discrimination is not the same as deciding who gets access and who's allowed to vote. I think that the states should have the ability to make the decisions about how elections are run and what equipment is used. I would like to see uniformity across the country, but that has not been what's happened. Like different states use different means to get to the end result. But when we're talking about discrimination, we have felony disenfranchisement. We started this thing in 1902 with the Constitution in Virginia that said that if you're convicted of a crime, you have the ability to, you have the inability to act as a moral standing citizen. And we know that and this is diving deeper into the conversation than what we're talking about, we know that most Black people were impacted by those crimes. We know that each year when we go to the General Assembly, a new set of laws is made, but nobody looks at the past and says, we were wrong about this. Do we take away a person's ability to participate in the civic process? So there are more people who have the inability to participate in the voting process. Virginia was one in 3 countries who permanently disenfranchised people. So there's that, but that has nothing to do with the state's ability to make the decisions about how we carry out secure elections and what we need to be successful with that. I don't think we disagree about the practical process, but we will definitely disagree about who has access to the ballot and who gets to vote, and to pretend to say that people who are convicted of crimes, knowing that there are a multitude of people who were sentenced to whatever their sentence was and come back, 95% of people who go into incarceration come back to our communities and they're not allowed to vote without going through the sitting governor, which means that whatever they think is correct at the time determines who gets to participate in the process. I think it's really important to understand that. The practical pieces of how voting happens should happen at the state level. And when we're talking about the nuanced pieces of what machines we use, what different tools we use, who is in charge of this, because if we're being fair, you represent, like there are people from each party and independents and people who choose not to identify with a party who manage these elections, and I'm talking about day of, in process.
Right. Yeah. So you know, there is a balance. The Constitution says that the time, place, and manner of elections shall be determined by the states, but the Congress can make or alter such rules. So there's, at the very founding, there was a balance of this. And I take it you guys are somewhat in agreement that that where that line may need to be drawn may vary a little bit, but that by and large, subject to the Voting Rights Act, and subject to a disparate impact, that there should be, the state should have the rights to make those decisions. I think that's what I'm hearing.
Yep.
All right, so now's the time you get to summarize your thoughts and let our audience know anything that you've learned from this that you or anything that you want to impart to them.
I think that people are more in agreement on the particulars of how elections take place. Certainly, Sheba and I are, than you might have thought when we first got here. Right. And that's a good thing. The organizations with whom I work now are formed to restore the trust in elections so that more people are educated on how elections, if you are educated and you have knowledge, you're less fearful. You have more trust. We want it to be, and this is a Virginia phrase, easy to vote, hard to cheat. And I don't know how anybody could disagree with that. We want access. We want people to register to vote. We want every vote to count, every eligible legal citizen to be able to vote. And that's where we're going. And I think the more people who are involved in that process, the better we are as a state or as a nation.
Right. Good. So Sheba?
Well, I think we do agree on a lot of things. I think that a lot of people believe that the people on the winning side of things automatically cheated, and that's not the case. I think the process deserves some integrity. I think that facts are important. I think we all believe in the integrity of elections, but it should not be questioned just because you're on the losing end, and I think that's what we're seeing a lot of times. I think that it is really important to understand that democracy, no matter how the coin flips, should be protected at all costs. I think that every person who participates in the process wants the same things. They want the integrity. They want to be able to trust. And I think the fear and the disinformation and misinformation that has been put out around the integrity of elections were scrutinized from a very narrow lens, and that was a tactic. Our elections have never been in question the way that they are now, and to take a person's voice and say their voice is not valid because I don't agree with their decisions is how we got to where we are. We all want the same things. We all believe in our process, and actors who wanted to question that were able to manipulate this process. I think it is imperative that we know that we have a secure process, and we should still be doing everything in our power to keep it a secure process. So, facts matter, the integrity matter, the security matters, but the most important thing is the voices of each individual should not be questioned just because they are different than your own.
Fair enough. So we'll leave it at that. I've learned a lot from you all. Thank you all for being here. I think our audience will learn a lot from what you've said. Well, we hope you found this discussion on voter access engaging and meaningful. Again, the goal of this civic engagement series is not to change minds, but to stimulate civil dialogue that leads to a discovery that there is common ground on many of the issues that divide us. I'm William Fralin. Thanks for joining us.
Under Consideration is a civic engagement project of Radio IQ and Blue Ridge PBS, with financial support from the Virginia Tech Foundation. We welcome your feedback and suggestions for future topics. Contact us through our website, radioiq.org.